became the cardinal intellectual discourse of our universities pretty much in the 1980s, 1990s and subsequently. Those theories are based upon the idea which radicalizes even the existentialist project of the 50s and 60s. And this is that there is no essential foundation to meaning. I remember a Marxist university professor I know quite well. He teaches at some upgraded poly, which is now called a university in London, Malcolm Evans, who wrote a book about Shakespeare called Signifying Nothing, which is a quote from Macbeth, of course. So there's clever interweaving of text going on here. But he basically believes that essentialism is dangerous. Because, of course, although your average Socialist Worker Party activist, and there's few of them left, would even think in these terms, it is a totally rival and totally discontinuous and totally oppositional way of thinking. They begin with man in his predicament. And the only way to get out of that predicament is to change one's environment, which creates the nature of that predicament. Heidegger's view is that everything is prior, and death is before you. And death, in accordance with essentially his religious nature, is what life is about. In other words, life is about preparing yourself for inexistence. Now, one of the sort of comets that goes across this sort of constellation, which could be said to be Heidegger, is Jean-Paul Sartre, who did his thesis in Germany, partly during the Nazi period. Sartre, this rather sort of short-sighted, ugly man stooping around, running about, didn't seem to know what was going on in Germany at this period. Indeed, there were circles of the left in post-war France who held it against Sartre that he actually studied in Germany during this period, influenced by these sorts of ideas. Now, Sartre takes these ideas in another direction. So he doesn't have a prior essence, that there are things like beauty with a big B, justice with a big J, truth with a big T, and so on, that exist prior to man. He believes that everything is unknown prior to specific consciousness. But you authenticate yourself in the possibility of being by confronting nothingness and filling the emptiness with volition. In his case, by choosing to be an extreme leftist. Life is utterly meaningless, but one chooses a course for one's life and for one's discourse. And this led him from myopic apoliticism and moping around in German libraries in the 1930s through to Maoism, essentially, because he basically ended up in a sort of Maoist sect before he died in the 1970s. Something which, because Pol Potable people passed through some of those Parisian salons in the 1970s, listening to people like Christeva and these other post-structuralist theorists, has rather doomed Sartre in post-war and after his death terms. Because you can't claim existentialism as a humanism when one of your moral pupils turns out to be Pol Pot. That's been a bit difficult, you see. But you have this extraordinary radicalism in the examples of these two men. Sartre ends up with Mao, put crudely, and Heidegger ends up with Hitler. Because both of them, if you like, begin thinking cardinally about the values of our civilization, which when you think about it logically, would lead them to some of the most radical conclusions, socio-politically and ideologically, which are possible. Because this type of intellectuality, and I'm going to read certain sections of it, because there is a pretension always to talking about people like Heidegger without dealing with what we'll call the hard core. You've actually got to look at the material, which is written in a sedentary way, but is written in a sense in accordance with the notion of intellectual fury. It's the belief that all of life and all of meaning can be revealed through mental processes, which I don't believe is true, but it's a heroic attempt to do this. And this sort of language is virtually a system of thinking which has more relationship with artistic ways of describing things, actually, because Heidegger's theory is something you have to experience. Here is a man dwelling upon ultimate questions of whether there is an essence in an essence, of what it means to be you, or this table, or anything that phenomenologically exists, or are there realms above us, or beneath us, or around us? And how can you answer a moral question with an affirmative statement? Wittgenstein's point in Tractatus and after is that ultimately you can't answer a morally affirmative statement because to do so is meaningless outside language, and language is all that exists, and language is given even only a partial meaning through context. There's a famous and funny story with Wittgenstein where he's ferociously berating an American visiting professor at Cambridge and says, "You can't make affirmative moral statements," and he's waving a poker in his face. And the university professor replies, "Here's an affirmative moral statement. Don't wave pokers in the faces of visiting professors." And Wittgenstein hurls the poker into the fire and storms out of the room in a rant. But these attempts, abstract and very radical though they are, always, like Icarus in a sense, go up and then come down again. Because mark my words, every politician and every pundit, no matter how low level, no matter how 200 times beneath this sort of discourse they are, is actually replicating ideas that have come from somewhere and are going somewhere. The reason why is, you walk around London today, the world is as it is ideological in the broadest of senses. Because a man who has any sort of belief becomes the equivalent of 50 men in action. And Heidegger was a man whose action was theory in this purely Germanic way. I met a German intellectual once and he said, "You're an intellectual." And he sits down and looks right into your eyes and you begin the theory. This is a totally un-British sort of way of behaving because there's no concept of irony in a way. But this idea that you achieve truth through almost the violence of intellectuality, which in a way Heidegger evinces. Now let's read something from Being and Time. Now Being and Time is divided into two books essentially. The first one is an explanation of the question of the meaning of being, the necessity, structure and priority of the question of being. This is whether we can even talk about the nature of talking about the book. We have the necessity for explicitly restating the question of being. We have the formal structure of the question of being. We have the ontological priority of the question of being. And we have the ontical priority of the question of being. That takes him 32 pages before he's even started. You've got to clear away all the grub, all the sort of refuse in your garden before you start, basically. Part one is the interpretation of Dasein in terms of temporality. That means the interpretations of being in terms of time. And the explication of time as the transcendental horizon for the question of being. Then there's another section about being in the world in general as the basic state of Dasein. Then there's a section on the worldhood of the world. The worldhood of the world, by which he means, is the world as we appear? Can we prove that you're actually there? Because it's actually very difficult from first principles to prove common sense. That I'm speaking to you, that I'm not speaking to myself, that it's a vision, that I'm talking about things that are endlessly solipsistic, in pure mental processes without being empirical, because this type of theory believes that empiricism distorts because you go down to matter, so you must keep it totally at a theoretical level. It's actually quite difficult to prove the idea that everything isn't an idea, and that even addressing you in this way is an idea, and so on. Being in the world as being within and bringing oneself to the they. This is the idea that one approaches the possibility of semi-existence in another, theoretically, before one gets there. Then one has being in, hyphenated, as such. Germans love these, intellectual Germans love these little as suches and so on. Care as the being of Dasein. Now this is the self-reflexiveness of the possibility of being in being. What does he mean by being in being? He really means the presence of God in life, really. Deep down, he, in my view, never left the Jesuits who trained him intellectually. And his thesis was on Duns Scotus. The idea that everything is essentially foregrounded before one gets there, theoretically. Now here's the second book, Division 2. Second book, Dasein and Temporality. Dasein's possibility of being a whole and being towards death, which is the real point, to place man in full understanding of it before death. Now, there's always with this sort of theory possibly a sort of alienation effect. But the way to look at it is there are a few moments of profundity in most individuals' lives. But one of them is that period when one is probably pretty conscious, but one is waiting for death. And it's going to happen to all of us, you and me. And in some ways, the way to overcome the sort of innate philistinism that exists about this pure theory is to put yourself in that position